Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture here. Today what we want to try to do is to begin over the next few weeks to look at different parts of the world and to see, given the fact that we've spent so much of the semester so far looking at the American perspectives on climate change, looking at the way that other countries and other parts of the world are tackling the issue now. Next couple of weeks we're going to be looking at Asia. Today we want to look at Europe. And the simple answer, the simple picture of this is that for better or worse, the Europeans have in many ways been the world leader in climate change policy. I just came back from Copenhagen a week ago, and while there's enormous debate here in the United States about whether or not to put wind turbines up 20 miles out to sea, I looked at my hotel room and saw 40 wind turbines just right along the coastline in ways that were far, far closer than anybody in the United States has ever even imagined in the middle of a big city. The Europeans simply have thought much more deeply, much more carefully, at much longer time about questions of climate change than virtually anyone else in the world. So the puzzle now is trying to figure out how to make some sense out of the policy initiatives that they're putting together, and then to look as well at the next generation of issues and puzzles that they're facing as well. Because the Europeans, quite frankly, have got to try to think very carefully about what it is that they're doing, where they're going, and where, as they go to Copenhagen, they're going to have to try to think about some new issues that they're going to have to try to tackle as well. So those are the puzzles that we want to try to deal with today, and we're going to be dealing with three things in particular. First, a look at the policy toward European and climate change and policy. We have a guest lecture that we're going to be bringing, as I said, from somebody who's an expert from Germany who made the presentation in Korea, so we're going to be able to share that on whatever globalization means, it's something like that. And then finally, an assessment of the nature of climate change policy in Europe and where some of those things are going. So let me look at some of those things. First point has to do with just the European perspective on climate change. And for a long time, both in a technological sense and in a policy sense, and probably most importantly from a philosophical perspective, the Europeans have been thinking about climate change for a very, very long time. In the very earliest stages of the climate change movement, the Europeans were really the ones who, in a very large and important way, were thinking carefully about what it is that ought to be done and the need to do it. As we explored earlier in the term, on a philosophical basis, what the Europeans did was to say that we have an obligation to future generations, we have an obligation to try to clean up the world. From a philosophical point, they began from a very different point of view than was the case in the United States, where so much of the battle and so much of the debate has been about jobs. Is climate change policy going to cost jobs? Can we create jobs? Is it going to slow the economy? Is it going to spur the economy? But in Europe, it's been much less of an economically based argument and much more of a moral and philosophically based argument. So there's been this really big difference in the fundamentals driving that. That's also driven some technological change as well, because some of the most aggressive and early efforts at trying to develop wind power have come out of Europe. France, as we know, has for a long time been relying very heavily on nuclear power. And at the time when the United States really slammed shut its efforts to try to develop nuclear power in the aftermath of 3 Mile Island, the French continued to develop theirs. And the long-term storage of nuclear waste, which is one of the big issues about nuclear power, really has been one of those things that the French have thought about with a process they call vitrification, which is to put spent nuclear fuel and glass logs for long-term storage and what they argue is a safer way. So if you look at both the philosophical basis and also the technological basis, Europe for a long time has prided itself as being the world's leader in climate change movement. What is it that we're going to do, and what is it how we're going to handle this, and where do these issues go from there? Let me try to talk about some of the concerns that Europe has framed and the kind of puzzles that they're dealing with. The first of which is that, and this is from a very recent European Commission report on the puzzles and problems of what's going on with climate change, as they look to the future and they look to the puzzles that they're going to be facing, here are the things on their menus of things that they're worried about. The first of which, they say, is they're worried about the possibility of smaller crop yields. That as we get deeper into what they see as the inescapable reality of climate change, they're worried about smaller yields from crops. They're worried, secondly, about the fact that extremely fragile but very widespread coastal and marine ecosystems may increasingly encounter problems, and some of them may increasingly fail because of what's happening with climate change and the way in which those fragile ecosystems may be affected. Third thing is that they're worried about tourism. Tourism, everything from what happens if it doesn't snow as much in the Alps, what happens, on the other hand, if it gets too hot to enjoy the beaches in the Mediterranean. So on both sides, what they're really concerned about is a real impact on tourism in important parts of Europe where the economy depends heavily on it. And they're concerned on top of that about more frequent and more extreme weather events, not just having to do with warmer weather and maybe more blizzards. They may be concerned about what happens with extreme weather conditions that happen in the Mediterranean. But there's also concern, for example, in places like Scotland that have lots of hills that are extremely prone to flooding when there's lots of rainfall that comes. And if there are big storms that hit with big surprises, just as was the case in what happened in New Orleans, they're concerned about catastrophic flooding events that could occur as a result of large storms that create large amounts of rainfall in places where it's hard for the ecosystem to handle large amounts of rainfall. And there's substantial discussion in England about what to do about significant flooding problems. So the concerns in Europe more broadly about what climate change can mean are really very substantial. In some ways they're similar to ours, but in an area where the countries are much more closely combined together, where there's the potential for, given all the enormous expanse of ocean, for big weather events to become important and effective, there's a big concern over what it is that all this may bring. So there's substantial concern in Europe about where this is going, coupled with concerns about climate. There's a very interesting new white paper that is just out within the last 2 weeks from the European Commission, and the link to that report is there. But one of the things that they have here is a graph that's included along with this and some of the predictions that they have about what's likely to happen with climate. And what you see here is not just everything getting warmer, but significant changes coming about as well, with significant warming happening in Spain and in Sicily and Italy and with Greece, and you see warming in southern Europe as well, but a concern that there are going to be other extremes that happen in northern parts of Europe as well. So the concerns are, excuse me, not just in terms of warming, but in terms of growing extremes of climate in addition to everything else. Excuse me, trying to fight off some hay fever. They have even developed a more complex model about what's going on. This is from the European Commission white paper here. And what they have is a series of scenarios that they're considering. Things that could happen that include greenhouse gas concentrations, more temperature extremes, as well as an overall change in average temperature. Same with precipitation, more storms, a rise in sea level, melting of permafrost, and an increase in ground level ozone. All those things are concerns that they have on their list, coupled with what could happen with changes in species, distribution, forest fires, water quality, floods, soil degradation, and water scarcity and droughts. So you have those concerns that they're bringing, coupled with economic impacts, impact on the ecosystem in terms of food, fresh water, as well as regulations, and social impacts. And for those, they look at issues like excuse me, health, resource conflicts, migration, social fabric, and bigger governance issues. In fact, for anybody who really cares about the question about why climate change matters, whether you believe this or not, whether you accept all the arguments that they make or not, the thing that's important about this chart is that the chart really covers a vast array of different kinds of concerns that lie at the very core of what it is that the debate over ecosystem management and climate change has to do. Because we're dealing with everything from whether or not there's going to be more flooding to whether or not the very process of dealing with these questions will require the Europeans as a community to try to deal with their basic problems of governance in a different way as well. So again, whether you accept climate change as immediate or a long-term phenomenon, it's hard to escape the fact that it brings fundamental challenges to a surprising and really vast array of different kinds of concerns. And the European Commission, as it's been trying to explore these questions and puzzles, has really been trying to get at these things head on. What are the big issues? As they chart these big issues that they're dealing with, there's a series of things here. First, they worry about cross-border impacts. The very reality of European integration, economic, social, political, means that because there are so many of the countries that are so small, so close to each other, that all the border questions, all the scale questions that we've talked about in the United States become compounded when we deal with those questions in Europe. They become compounded when we try to ask ourselves, what is it and how is it that the European states can deal with these puzzles? Coordination increasingly is going to be important, not only within the European Union, and the European Union, as we know itself, has often difficult problems of coordination among its individual elements, but there are non-members of the European Union within Europe that are not part of the European coordinating mechanism. And as with everything else, climate change is something that pays no attention to borders. And so any kind of consolidated, clear, effective strategy is going to be some kind of requirement for new governance arrangements. Second thing is an effort to try to deal with solidarity. How do you try to develop a coordinated, consistent policy, on the one hand, dealing, on the other hand, with reality, with impacts and effects that are going to vary tremendously by geography? As the graph suggested before, the chart suggested there's some parts of Europe, especially Spain and southern Italy and Greece, that are likely to have tremendous impacts in terms of warmer temperatures. But on the other hand, there's some parts of Europe that may be more affected less by the temperature changes than by an increase in severity of storms. So what climate change means is going to depend dramatically on where it is that you live. Everybody's going to be affected, but everybody's likely to be affected differently. The third point is the need for some kind of European-level cross-border action, but with a problem of trying to figure out what kind of governance strategy can be created to try to make that happen. How is it that Europe, as Europe, is going to be able to make decisions to make this happen? The challenge is trying to figure out, quite simply, how it is that the European Union and the European Commission, struggling as it is to try to deal with just basic questions as it is, will deal with this next generation of economic, social, political impacts that climate change raised. Now, in some ways, these are the puzzles that the European Union has to try to deal with in any event, so just framing them, pushing them forward, making them inescapable. But they're still very hard problems that the European Union finds itself inevitably having to try to deal with. And then on top of that, there's the adaptation problem that we've increasingly been talking about. Of all the things that perhaps have come out in the aftermath of the Kyoto protocols, the one thing that's come about in a way that's inescapable is the sense that, we thought in Kyoto that we had a little bit more time. But what has happened in the eyes of many scientists since is that the imperative for quick action has in fact increased, and that we don't have as much time as we thought. And not only do we have not as much time as we thought, but that increasingly we have to try to figure out how to deal with the consequences that are now inescapable because we've delayed, in the eyes of many scientists, too long. That's the process that we've been discussing as adaptation. And the challenge now is trying to figure out how Europe can deal with adaptation. Are there going to be subsidies? Are there going to be subsidies from country to country? How is that going to work? Then on top of that, there's the problem of negotiating power and dealing with global concerns. How will Europe, as Europe, deal with the United States, deal with China, deal with South America and countries like Brazil? How will it deal with India and how will it deal with the questions of emerging economies versus developed economies? Europe has been criticized because, on the one hand, there have been a lot of arguments over a long time where Europe said, no, we were one of the first ones to recognize the development, the need for us to try to assist developing countries. But developing countries have been criticizing Europe for not putting in as much cash forward as is actually needed to be able to make that work. Europe is worried about its negotiating place with respect to the United States, because Europe doesn't want to have to bear the costs of trying to deal with climate change if other countries are not going to come to the fore. Europe is worried about what happens if the United States comes to the table, but China does not, and India does not, and Brazil does not. And how does it try to deal with the vast complications of trying to get anything to happen if the burden, in fact, is not shared? And so the problem of trying to figure out what Europe as Europe means in the context of this broader set of negotiations is itself a further set of concerns that Europe has to try to deal with. So what does this all add up to before we get to our guest lecture from Germany? It means, first, that they keep talking about coherence and integration, about coherence of a European policy as European and a way to try to create integration across national boundaries. But that remains an elusive goal. Second thing is that there, as I just suggested, there's been this argument about the need for increasing support for the needs of developing countries to try to deal with this. And in the middle of trying to deal with its own set of economic concerns, Europe's been criticized for not stepping up as much as it should. Third point is that there's a concern that the aggressive targets for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that Europe's pursued hasn't necessarily, in the eyes of many scientists, produced the reduction in carbon emissions that everybody was hoping for. And so the question is, how can you justify pushing yourself hard to try to reduce the targets when the reduction of the targets doesn't seem to produce improvements in long-term carbon emissions? And industry, finally, industry which is increasingly paying no attention to boundaries whatsoever. You look most recently at the episode of a pirate ship that was seized off the coast of Somalia that was operated by an American flag carrier owned by a Danish company, being rescued off the coast of Africa, being attacked by pirates from yet another country altogether. Whatever globalization means, it has to do with the fact that industry is in a position where it simply pays no attention to those international boundaries. And so the increasing point is that industry needs to try to figure out what those international boundaries really mean. And so what we're going to be doing is moving to cases from Asia next week. But before doing that, what we want to try to do is to look carefully now at the case and the problem and the puzzle from Europe. Here, now, what the plan is from here for the rest of today is that we're going to watch the guest lecture that was prepared by Robert Schwartz, who is a scholar from Germany, is going to be talking about climate change policy in the European Union. And this was a guest lecture that he prepared and delivered at Kyunghee University in Korea, which is one of the partners with which we're working. So as we've only half joked about the meaning of globalization, a German expert talking about European climate change policy in Korea sent to us by email, by link, that then we prepare and put on YouTube and then include in our social networking site to be able to distribute to everyone else. Whatever globalization means, it looks something like that. So let me fire up this video, and we'll have a chance to watch that and to be able to share some of this European experience about the nature of climate change policy. Now, it's fascinating to get a look at the way in which people in other countries look at the same issues that we do. Not only is the nature of the issues and the discussion different, not only is the perspective on the policy challenges a bit different as well, but even more fundamentally is, in a sense, the kind of cultural foundation with which people approach some of these things. If you look at the way in which, for example, a German frames the issue of climate change, there really is this fundamental piece about we want to be a leader in this. We want to try to do it because it's the right thing. We want to try to establish this as a foundation for establishing that Europe can, in fact, govern itself through the European Union. All sets of issues that are very different from the way in which the United States traditionally has handled and approached these puzzles and issues. The debate's very different from the way in which the debate in the United States is going on as well now. And the second point that's worth making as well, for those of us here in the United States, is you can see the question, the shadow, the cloud that's hanging over and has been hanging over American policy as well. The basic question of whether or not the United States is interested in and will be willing to come to the table as leaders in itself in the next round of climate change negotiations. Those two things in particular, I think, are fascinating for us here in the United States to consider as we explore the questions of the worldwide approach to climate change. And we'll be looking at some of those things next week as we look at some of the policy challenges and changes that emerge out of Asia. So there's a separate set of readings that we've distributed, and there will have a lecture as well from our colleagues in Asia that looking at some of the Chinese and Korean perspectives on some of this as well. So we'll return to those puzzles when we return to this question next week. So let me just turn this off and we can talk about it.